Redstone Valley was not a place built on harmony or compromise. It was carved from sweat, greed, and the stubborn belief that land made a man invincible. Every fence line was a declaration, every ranch brand a flag of war, and every handshake a cautious truce that could dissolve with a single insult. Dust storms swept across the valley like warnings from the earth itself, swirling grit into eyes and lungs until even the most boastful cowboy tasted humility. Gunsmoke often lingered longer than apologies, and funerals grew more common than barn dances. Men boasted of power, but everyone knew the truth. The valley belonged to whoever rode hardest, shot straightest, and refused to bend. Into this cauldron of pride and fear came a rider whose presence stirred rumor before he even reached the main street. His name whispered through saloons, poker tables, and stables like a secret no one dared examine too closely. Caleb Blackthorne was a black cowboy whose legend stretched from the borderlands to the northern territories. People said he was born in a dust storm, raised by renegades, and trained by fate itself. Others insisted he once tamed a wild stallion using nothing but a rope and pure will, staring into the creature's eyes until it surrendered. Whether any of it was true didn't matter. What mattered was the feeling that followed him, danger wrapped in silence. Caleb rode a sleek, coal-colored horse with a silver blaze streaking down its nose, a beast that obeyed no one else. His clothes were weathered but clean, his boots polished from use rather than vanity, and his revolver sat low on his hip, easy to reach and impossible to ignore. He didn't swagger like other men who tried to fill space with noise. He didn't grin or spit insults. He moved like someone who understood exactly who he was. That confidence unsettled those who had built their identities on the false comfort of superiority. Skin color had been used to measure worth in Redstone Valley, but Caleb's silence dismantled prejudice more effectively than any speech. The first time he rode through the central street, shopkeepers paused mid-transaction, and horses stamped nervously in their stalls. Men instinctively touched their belts, reassessing their weapons as if unsure whether the stranger's calm expression concealed violence. In a world where boasting was currency, Caleb possessed a wealth none of them could understand, a refusal to bow. He neither nodded to the sheriff nor tipped his hat to the ranchers. His gaze flicked from horizon to horizon, judging the land like someone deciding whether it was worth conquering. In the largest house overlooking the valley, Evelyn Hartwell stood on a second-floor balcony, fingers gripping the iron railing while her heart fluttered with an emotion she didn't yet know how to name. She had grown up surrounded by rules disguised as traditions and expectations masquerading as destiny. Her father owned 3 ranches, 500 cattle, and every ounce of pride that came with those possessions. He believed wealth gave him the right to dictate the direction of his daughter's eyes, thoughts, and future. Evelyn had accepted that belief for years, but Caleb's arrival cracked something inside her mind, like sunlight pushing through shutters nailed shut. She wasn't supposed to notice the stranger's stillness or the quiet strength that followed him. She wasn't supposed to admire the easy confidence with which he dismounted his horse, tied the reins, and surveyed the auction yard. Yet she couldn't look away. His presence didn't just disturb her routine, it uprooted her understanding of who was allowed to matter. The ranchers she knew strutted like roosters, bragging about cattle sales, land acquisitions, and gunfights that grew more exaggerated each time they were retold. Caleb didn't need stories. He was one. When he approached the corral where a vicious Mustang bucked and snapped at anyone foolish enough to draw near, silence fell like a curtain. The animal had already injured 2 men, and most spectators muttered that it should be put down before it killed someone. Caleb studied the Mustang with a patience that unnerved witnesses. He leaned against the fence, waiting until the horse stopped rearing and looked back at him, puzzled by a human who didn't fear it. Without raising his voice, Caleb vaulted over the fence, landing softly in the dirt. The crowd gasped. Evelyn's breath caught. The horse charged. Caleb didn't flinch. He moved with astonishing precision, sidestepping the animal's fury until he found the rhythm of its rage. He touched its flank lightly, letting it feel his presence before asserting control. Minutes passed like hours. Dust rose, hooves thundered, and the audience stood motionless. Then, with a final wrench of will, the Mustang bowed its head. Caleb swung onto its back as though claiming a birthright. The applause was hesitant, not because the feat lacked brilliance, but because Redstone Valley had seen something it wasn't prepared to understand. Men who owned land now questioned whether they truly possessed power. Caleb didn't conquer the horse, he earned its respect. That distinction terrified those who mistook ownership for authority. Evelyn pressed a hand against her chest, feeling her pulse race. She had never met a man who didn't ask permission to exist. Her father demanded obedience through rules and fear. Suitors paraded manners that masked hunger for her inheritance more than her affection. Caleb was different. He didn't try to impress anyone. He didn't once look toward the balcony, yet she felt as though he had seen her completely. The distance between them seemed fragile, like a veil waiting to tear. In that moment, Evelyn realized a truth she couldn't name aloud. Some storms arrive not to destroy, but to reveal what stands firm when everything else collapses. Caleb's arrival wasn't an accident. It was a challenge to every boundary Redstone Valley had constructed. For the first time in her life, Evelyn felt the stirrings of rebellion, not against her father, but against the invisible cage she'd mistaken for safety. The Wild West didn't care about rules carved by fear, and neither, she suspected, did she anymore. The stables behind the Hartwell Ranch were usually a place of order, a world of hay bales stacked like towers and polished saddles waiting for obedient horses. That night, however, they became something else entirely. A storm had passed hours earlier, leaving behind the heavy scent of rain mingling with the musk of animals. The lantern hanging from a nail flickered softly, casting shadows that seemed to breathe. Evelyn slipped inside with the quiet steps of someone who had never before stepped out of line. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a reminder that she was doing something unthinkable. She had no plan, no excuse, and no intention of turning back. Caleb stood beside a horse the color of midnight, brushing its maner with the careful precision of a man accustomed to earning trust. He didn't look up when she entered, but he felt her presence. The air between them shifted, thick enough to choke caution. For the first time in her life, Evelyn wasn't Evelyn Hartwell, daughter of a powerful rancher. She was simply a woman staring at a man who represented everything her world denied her. Her upbringing taught her to fear what she didn't understand, yet fear brought her to him. Desire rooted her in place. She moved closer, each step eroding a lifetime of restrictions. Caleb finally turned, and their eyes locked. There was no greeting, no polite gesture, no attempt at civility. Words had no place here. The silence wasn't empty. It pulsed, filled by the tension of two lives touching long before their bodies did. Evelyn's chest tightened. She sensed that one breath, one misplaced syllable, could shatter the moment. But she had already crossed a line, and there was no retreat for someone who had tasted the thrill of defiance. Her voice emerged brittle and raw, carrying the sharp edge of confession rather than curiosity. "I've never touched a black cowboy before." Time fractured. Caleb didn't flinch, nor did he smirk. He didn't move at all. His stillness wasn't fear, confusion, or arrogance. It was choice. Her words carried he could have ended it there. A simple step backward and the moment would have dissolved into awkward silence. The rancher's daughter would return to her gilded prison, and Caleb would continue pretending that self-respect was enough. But Evelyn wasn't looking at him like something to be managed or avoided. She looked at him as if he was the first truth she had ever seen. That gaze disarmed him more than any weapon. Evelyn reached out, fingers trembling with equal parts terror and hunger. She touched his hand lightly, but the sensation jolted both of them. Her fingertips traced the ridges and healed wounds along his palm. His scars weren't imperfections. They were chapters of a life carved without permission, proof of battles survived without witnesses. In that touch, she learned more about Caleb than her father's entire world ever taught her about men. Something cracked open inside him. Caleb's life had been forged from labor, silence, and the quiet dignity of refusing to bow. He knew better than to trust softness. Softness often hid traps. Yet Evelyn's touch carried no superiority, only longing. Her fingers lingered, not demanding ownership but offering recognition. That distinction sliced through all the defenses he had built. The horse behind him snorted, unsettled by the tension thickening the air. Evelyn didn't pull away. Instead, she stepped closer, close enough for him to feel her breath. Nothing about her was timid. She wasn't ignorant of danger, she was intoxicated by it. Caleb's jaw tightened. He wasn't a man who lost control. Control had kept him alive. But control meant nothing now. Their first kiss was not tender. It was inevitable. Their lips met like two storms colliding, reckless and unstoppable. Her hands clutched his shirt, dragging him closer as though afraid he might vanish. Caleb responded with the urgency of someone who had spent years denying himself the luxury of wanting. The kiss didn't taste like rebellion. It tasted like oxygen. Nights followed, each one more perilous than the last. They met in secret beneath moonlit rafters with straw prickling their backs and adrenaline painting their skin with heat. Their conversations weren't about dreams or promises. They whispered fragments of their souls, exposing wounds and craving what neither had experienced: freedom. Caleb taught Evelyn how to read the land, how to listen to wind, and how to decipher truth without words. Evelyn taught Caleb how desire didn't have to be a burden. It could be a sanctuary. Their meetings became ritual. He would arrive through the darkened trail, leaving no tracks. She would slip from her room, dodging guards who believed they protected her honor. Their hands explored without hesitation, their bodies learning the language of touch long before either admitted how deep the connection went. They didn't love each other yet, but love was already sharpening its blade. However, no secret lives forever in a place built on ownership. The ranch hands began noticing footprints that didn't match scheduled duties. Horses stirred restlessly at night, snorting toward shadows with unblinking suspicion. Whispers slithered through bunkhouses and saloons. Redstone Valley had ears sharpened by gossip and tongues trained to weaponize rumor. Men who believed power entitled them to control everything sensed something slipping beyond their reach. The valley didn't rage immediately. It simmered. People watched Evelyn with narrowed eyes and scrutinized Caleb with renewed hostility. They didn't need evidence. They needed suspicion. A world built on fear hates anything it can't categorize, and nothing was harder to define than a desire that tore through the foundation of prejudice. Evelyn didn't care. She felt alive. Caleb didn't hesitate. He felt claimed. Neither understood the storm that brewed beyond their stolen nights, waiting to strike. The Wild West tolerated violence, hardship, and lawlessness. But it did not forgive defiance that challenged its hierarchy. A rancher's daughter and a cowboy who refused to bow were not merely breaking rules. They were unmaking them. And the West was preparing to exact a price. Rancher William Hartwell lived his life like a man convinced the world owed him obedience. His land stretched farther than his morals, his wealth spilled beyond the borders of fairness, and his pride overshadowed the sky itself. He measured respect in cattle, alliances in acres, and loyalty in silence. People didn't follow him because they admired him. They followed because opposing him meant ruin. His power wasn't inherited from the land. It was squeezed from the throats of those too afraid to challenge his grip. To him, control was not an option. It was birthright. For years, Hartwell believed fear was enough to secure order. His daughter was the jewel of his empire, molded for a marriage that would expand his dominion. He raised Evelyn like a prized mare, beautiful, admired, destined to be traded for something tangible. Her opinions were ornaments, her feelings irrelevant, her future predetermined. He loved her in the way a man loves property, a kind of affection drenched in possession rather than tenderness. That twisted version of love blinded him to the rebellion simmering behind her eyes. The first hint arrived not through words, but through behavior. Evelyn moved differently. She no longer bowed her head when spoken to. She vanished from the house at odd hours, returning with wind-tangled hair and cheeks flushed with secrets. Servants whispered about her strange glow, about laughter they overheard late at night drifting from the stables. Hartwell dismissed it at first. His daughter was restless, he told himself. She would settle soon. She always had. But restlessness doesn't reshape a person's soul. Something had changed. Something dangerous. One evening, a ranch hand approached Hartwell with a trembling voice, as though speaking might summon demons. He mentioned footprints in the hay, a stallion saddled when no one claimed to have ridden it, and shadows moving where shadows didn't belong. Hartwell listened without blinking. His mind didn't jump to fear. It leapt to fury. For the first time, he questioned whether his daughter still belonged entirely to him. He decided to watch. The moon hung heavy, casting silver across the land. Hartwell moved quietly across the ranch, boots silent against the packed earth. The stables glowed with faint lantern light, not bright enough to expose, but enough to tempt curiosity. As he drew closer, voices drifted through the cracks, whispers, laughter, breaths laced with hunger. Something primal twisted inside him. He pushed the door open just enough to see. There they were. Evelyn, pressed against Caleb Blackthorne as though she had been carved for that very purpose. Her hands rested against his chest. His lips brushed her throat. Their closeness wasn't a mistake or confusion. It was certainty. It was choice. It was everything Hartwell had never allowed. The world tilted. Hartwell's jaw clenched. His vision tunneled. His legacy, threatened not by a rival rancher, but by a man he considered unworthy of existence. Rage roared inside him, not because of the intimacy he witnessed, but because Evelyn had dared to choose something beyond his control. She had chosen a future he couldn't manipulate. He didn't storm inside immediately. His restraint came from something darker than shock: calculation. Pain delivered in haste was wasteful. Pain delivered as spectacle was unforgettable. He turned away, walking back toward the house with the cold determination of a man planning war. Hartwell waited until Caleb arrived at the stables again. Evelyn was there, expecting another night of stolen bliss. She didn't see the guards emerging from the shadows, didn't notice the rope coiled in the leader's hands, or the fury radiating from her father like heat from the desert. Caleb did. He stepped in front of her, instinct overriding caution. His stance was calm, but his muscles braced for violence. Hartwell pointed at Caleb, voice echoing like a death sentence. "Take him outside." Evelyn lunged forward, screaming for them to stop, but her father's grip clamped around her wrist. She kicked and clawed, but it was useless. 2 guards dragged Caleb into the yard. Another tore off his hat and struck him in the ribs. Caleb didn't cry out. Pain was a language he'd mastered long ago. The silence enraged Hartwell more than any insult. "Beat him," Hartwell commanded, his tone smooth as poison. "Make him remember who owns this land." Fists thundered against bone. Boots crashed into muscle. Caleb's blood marked the dirt like fallen stars. He remained upright longer than any man should, refusing to kneel. Every blow proved something Evelyn had always suspected. Her father's authority wasn't strength, it was cowardice hiding behind others' hands. Evelyn broke free from Hartwell's grasp and ran toward Caleb. Guards blocked her path, ignoring her screams. Her father watched, arms crossed, expression carved from stone. To him, this wasn't cruelty. It was correction. He believed pain would sever her attachment and humiliate the cowboy into nothingness. When Caleb finally fell to his knees, Hartwell stepped forward, towering over him. "You thought you could touch what belongs to me," he snarled. Caleb spat blood onto Hartwell's boots. It wasn't defiance. It was truth. Some men are born unowned. Hartwell's face twisted. "This cowboy dies. And you," he said, turning to Evelyn, "will marry a man worthy of your name." Her scream split the air. Caleb's eyes lifted toward her through blood and dust, not pleading for rescue, but etching her voice into memory. Hartwell believed he'd won. He didn't realize he'd sparked something unstoppable. He didn't kill a romance. He forged a war. The beating of Caleb Blackthorne should have been the end of the scandal. William Hartwell believed punishment erased sin and humiliation rewrote loyalty. Yet the bruises on Caleb's body did not silence the whispers. They grew louder. Redstone Valley fed on gossip the way wolves fed on wounded prey. A rancher's daughter caught with a black cowboy was no passing rumor. It was a spark dragging itself across centuries of prejudice and pride. Hartwell needed more than violence. He needed a transaction brutal enough to restore his name. He chose marriage, not as union, but as weapon. Edmund Thatcher entered the story like a vulture descending upon dying flesh. He was older than Hartwell by 2 decades, his frame stiff from years on horseback and his lungs rattling from too much whiskey. His eyes, however, were sharp enough to spot opportunity before others tasted smoke. Thatcher owned cattle but lacked something far more valuable: legacy. He had no sons, no daughters, no blood waiting to inherit the empire he carved with stubborn fists. Hartwell's offer, Evelyn, exchanged for a vast piece of land, felt like salvation wrapped in cruelty. He didn't ask if she wanted him. Desire wasn't part of the negotiation. The arrangement was made in less than an hour. Contracts were drawn, whiskey was poured, and 2 powerful men congratulated themselves for turning a woman into currency. Evelyn was summoned but not consulted. She arrived in her father's office with her chin raised, unaware that her fate had already been auctioned off. The locked expression on Hartwell's face told her everything. His authority tolerated no disobedience. She was property, and property did not protest. Evelyn's world narrowed to a hollow ringing in her ears as the details unfolded. Thatcher spoke to her with a gentleness that sickened her more than cruelty would have. His voice carried entitlement disguised as affection, his compliments dripping with ownership rather than admiration. He called her dear, not to honor her, but to claim her. When Hartwell handed her over, Evelyn realized she wasn't being married. She was being transferred. Thatcher's ranch, miles away from the Hartwell estate, became her prison. Iron bars did not surround it, but her confinement was no less real. Every door locked from the outside, every window guarded by ranch hands sworn to Thatcher's will. He gifted her dresses she didn't request, meals she didn't taste, and words she didn't answer. His generosity was a chain wrapped in silk. Days passed without freedom. Nights dragged like chains across stone. Evelyn's fury simmered beneath her skin, yet something else stirred within her. Her body felt different, strange, restless, alive in ways that defied logic. A persistent nausea clung to her mornings. Her thoughts drifted toward Caleb, not with longing alone, but with certainty. One morning, after trembling hands and sleepless hours, she pressed her palm against her stomach. A realization struck like lightning. She carried Caleb's child. Her knees buckled. The stable nights had not ended in mere memory. They had seeded a future no contract could erase. Terror and strength collided inside her. Fear whispered that the valley would destroy her unborn child before allowing its existence. Strength answered that her child was not a mistake. It was truth. It was defiance. It was life born out of a love nobody sanctioned. Suddenly, Evelyn's captivity took on new meaning. She wasn't just fighting to escape a marriage she never chose. She was fighting for a bloodline Hartwell would try to choke out of existence. The child growing inside her became armor. Every breath she drew was no longer for survival, it was preparation. Meanwhile, in the desert beyond Redstone Valley, Caleb faced death with stubborn hatred. The guards who beat him assumed his shattered body would remain where they left it, baking beneath the sun until vultures stripped his bones clean. They underestimated him. Caleb Blackthorne did not surrender. Pain was not his enemy. It was a companion he had carried since childhood. He rose with broken ribs, bloody lips, and a heartbeat louder than fate. Each step forward tore muscle from bone, yet each step was a vow. He whispered Evelyn's name not as plea, but as promise. He did not know she carried his child. He didn't need to. Love alone pushed him onward. Caleb survived rattlesnakes, hunger, and fevered nights when his vision blurred and his body trembled. He followed stars when paths disappeared and drank from rivers when thirst threatened madness. The desert tried to bury him. He refused to be soil. Rumors of his survival drifted into Thatcher's ranch like ghosts. Ranch hands spoke of seeing a rider limping across the plains, a man who should have been dead but moved like vengeance. Thatcher dismissed the tales, sure that myths bloomed from guilt. Hartwell, however, felt something colder. Men like him recognized when danger refused to die. His rage twisted into dread. A wounded man with purpose was far more dangerous than any hired gun. Evelyn, locked in her room, heard the whispers and smiled for the first time since her imprisonment. Caleb wasn't gone. He walked the earth with stubborn defiance. Her father's empire trembled at the thought of a man who didn't bow returning for what had been stolen. Evelyn pressed her hand to her belly again and whispered a promise to the life growing inside her. The West believed fate could be bought. She would prove otherwise. Thatcher noticed her silence, mistaking it for acceptance. He imagined her submission meant victory. He didn't understand that stillness sometimes precedes thunder. Evelyn was no longer a frightened daughter. A man beaten may kneel. A man broken may crawl. But a man with purpose rises. And Caleb was rising. The night the sky split open, Redstone Valley felt like the world was holding its breath. Lightning clawed across the heavens, thunder rolled like judgment, and rain crashed down in furious sheets. It was the kind of storm mothers prayed over and ranchers cursed. But for one man, it was not a warning. It was an announcement. Caleb Blackthorne returned. He rode through the storm like it belonged to him, water streaming from his coat, jaw clenched with a resolve forged in suffering. The desert hadn't claimed him. Death hadn't welcomed him. Every bruise he carried had hardened into purpose. He wasn't coming back for pity, forgiveness, or fairness. He was coming back for what had been taken. Thatcher's ranch lay ahead, lit by lanterns flickering wildly against the wind. Dogs barked, horses reared, and ranch hands peered into the darkness, unable to tell whether the storm or the stranger was more dangerous. Caleb didn't hide in shadows. He galloped straight through the front gate, his horse screaming defiance with every stride. Guards scrambled, grabbing rifles with shaking hands. No one expected a dead man to return. Inside the house, Edmund Thatcher raised a glass of whiskey, celebrating a deal he believed had secured him legacy. The last thing he expected was a knock powerful enough to rattle the walls. Before he could shout, the door exploded inward. Caleb stood in the threshold, drenched, eyes burning with a fury no rain could extinguish. Thatcher reached for his shotgun, but hesitation sealed his fate. Caleb drew faster than thought, faster than memory, faster than fear. The gunshot echoed like thunder's reply. Thatcher collapsed, spilling whiskey and blood into the same stain. The man who tried to buy a future with someone else's daughter died without finishing his breath. There were no speeches, no warnings, no hesitation. Justice didn't pause. The guards who once mocked Caleb froze in terror. They remembered the man they beat. They remembered the look in his eyes. Now those eyes were back, and unbroken. Some dropped their weapons. Others ran. Not a single one stepped forward. Hatred was bold when Caleb was bleeding. It turned to cowardice when Caleb stood. Upstairs, Evelyn heard the shot. Her heart didn't stop, it expanded. She tore through the hallway, ignoring shouts and threats. She found him standing over the fallen tyrant, rain sliding from his hat brim. Caleb looked up, and every second they'd been apart collapsed into dust. She didn't walk to him. She flew. Her hands clutched his face, her tears mixing with rain as though the storm had been summoned for this reunion. When his arms wrapped around her, the world finally made sense again. She guided his hand to her stomach. Caleb froze. He felt life beneath her heartbeat, his child, their legacy, their defiance incarnate. The storm outside roared louder, but nothing matched the thunder in his chest. He had returned for a woman. He found a family. There was no time for tenderness. No time for explanations. Hartwell's men would be coming. The valley would awaken screaming for revenge. Their love was now a crime carved into history. Caleb lifted Evelyn onto his horse, swung into the saddle behind her, and kicked into the darkness. Rain swallowed their tracks. Thunder hid their escape. By dawn, every ranch, tavern, and trading post knew the truth. Caleb Blackthorne lived. Thatcher didn't. Evelyn was gone. The valley turned savage with pursuit. Sheriffs offered bounties. Bounty hunters sharpened knives. Hartwell raged like a wounded beast. But none of it mattered. Fear is loud. Love is louder. And love that survives death doesn't run. It conquers. Caleb and Evelyn disappeared into the high country long before sunrise could expose their escape. The mountains loomed like ancient guardians, their rocky peaks wrapped in drifting clouds that seemed to swallow anyone brave enough to enter. The law rarely ventured that far. Even sheriffs who swore loyalty to Hartwell avoided trails where the wind carried strange sounds and the trees grew thick enough to suffocate light. It was a place where the world forgot its rules. For Caleb and Evelyn, that was exactly what made it home. They rode for days, stopping only when the landscape opened into a secluded valley no map dared to name. The grass swayed like a welcoming sea, rivers shimmered with silver reflections, and the silence felt like absolution from every sin Redstone Valley tried to pin on them. In that untouched land, they built a life from scratch. Caleb scavenged wood and stone until a cabin took shape against the mountainside, sturdy enough to endure storms and hidden enough to silence pursuit. Evelyn transformed from sheltered daughter into partner and survivor. Caleb taught her to ride with confidence, shoot with precision, and track movement by reading the smallest bend of grass. These lessons were not about violence, they were about independence. Evelyn learned that strength was not inherited from her father's wealth but forged through choice. In return, she taught Caleb something he never believed belonged to him. She gave him trust without condition. No battle, no victory, and no wound had ever granted him that. It made him more powerful than any gun. Months passed, and the valley grew from sanctuary into kingdom. Their child came into the world beneath a sky so wide it resembled a freshly opened heaven. Evelyn held her newborn while Caleb stood guard at the cabin door, not out of fear, but reverence. The child's first cry echoed against the mountains, a sound that seemed to awaken something older than time. Caleb touched the tiny hand curled in Evelyn's palm and understood that everything he had fought for had not been rebellion. It had been creation. Rumors soon drifted beyond the mountains like smoke escaping a dying fire. Travelers swore they glimpsed a black cowboy on horseback, riding with the confidence of someone who feared nothing born of man. Others whispered about a woman with hair the color of captured fire and eyes sharpened by wilderness. Together, they said, The pair ruled a hidden valley where no preacher's sermon or rancher's law dictated how people should live. Some insisted that Caleb governed with the same steel that had defied Hartwell. Others argued no one ruled at all. Freedom, after all, could not be owned. It could only be lived. Hartwell spent his remaining years hunting ghosts. He rode through town after town, paying informants, harassing lawmen, and cursing the heavens for denying him closure. He never understood that he wasn't chasing